Good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Rees. I'm with the Northwest Sport Fishing Industry Association and also publisher for the Guides Forecast. And tonight we've got two wonderful icons of our community here in the room. Mike Sallee to my immediate right here. And of course, Frank Amato in the corner pocket, celebrating 57 years of salmon trout steelheader success. Tony is working the cameras behind the scene. He's usually up here at the table, but I was very grateful. Frank asked me a couple weeks ago to come have a conversation about 50 years of success with a steelhead being a game fish. Have I got the terminology right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, two iconic people here that really helped that movement. So many people in the younger generation, myself included, not that I'm that much younger than these gentlemen, but take it for granted that steelhead was once a commercially caught and sold fish in the Pacific Northwest. So we'd love to hear some stories about how that happened. There's been some changes, of course, with sport fishing over the decades. Not all good. We'll talk about that a little bit tonight too. But if one of you two folks wouldn't mind giving us a little history about the 50-year anniversary of steelhead becoming a game fish, I think the audience would appreciate that.
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is it was a game fish in Oregon since 1921, but it was regulated by at that time, the Oregon Game Commission. The Oregon Game Commission and the Oregon Fish Commission were two different agencies. And in 1969, the Northwest Steelheaders put a bill into the Oregon State Legislature trying to make it a game fish so it couldn't be sold commercially. And that was turned down. It was watered down, I should say, at that time, to where it didn't have any effect. And so the steelheaders and other sportsmen at that time dropped the bill and said they'll come back. I first worked in the Oregon legislature in 1973 when it was reintroduced, and we couldn't get anywhere. Couldn't even get it out of committee. And shortly thereafter is when Walt McGovern became president of Northwest Steelheaders in Oregon and really put a lot of effort into trying to figure a way to get that job done. And that's how 1974 came along. In 1974, I was a vice president of the Oregon Northwest Steelheaders. And remember, at that time, the Steelheaders were in 3 states. They were Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We didn't have many members in Idaho, but we had, in 1974, 3,300 members in the state of Washington and 2,700 in the state of Oregon. State of Oregon, we had 28 chapters at that time.
Wow.
Portland, which I had come from, when I was vice president, Portland chapter had 515 members when I left the chapter and became vice president. What happened in 1974, when I was vice president, Kerry Starzinger was the president also from the Portland chapter. And when Walt put together the Save Oregon Rainbows Trout Committee, Kerry decided to do that and said, you get to be the president of the Northwest Steelheaders. And I kind of, said, oh, really? and that's how I became president. So he worked on the committee along with Walt and several other organizations. Walt was able to put together 11 different sports fishing organizations on that committee. And one of his cohorts was from Oklahoma Anglers Club, Randy Rancourt. And the two of them, along with the executive director of the Northwest Steelheaders, Chuck Voss, are the one that headlined that committee.
That is fascinating history. Frank, yourself, I grew up reading your magazine. I started the Guides Forecast about 25 years ago, kind of based on the idea that we would engage anglers not just as an informational resource, but also as somewhat of a politically active constituency. And I read your editorials since I was a kid. They didn't mean as much to me as a youngster as they do now. I should go back and read some of those, actually. But you had an important role in educating the sport angling public to get involved with sport fishing organizations, and also this initiative of making steelhead a sport fish. Can you give us a little history on that?
Yeah, I was kind of a real serious steelhead fisherman from about the age of 10 or 12 on. I lived in Portland, but my parents moved to Milwaukee, and I hooked my first steelhead in Kellogg Creek, just a tributary of, it comes off of Mount Scott in southeast Portland. And by the time I got into high school, I was interested in reading anything I could get my hands on about steelhead. There were Sports Afield was out there, and also Field and Stream, and maybe a couple other magazines, but they hardly ever had any articles about Northwest fishing. But I worked when I went to high school at Central Catholic. I started there in 1960, or I should say 1957. The boss would let me go out to the newsstand during my lunch break, and I could grab a magazine. And every once in a while, as long as I didn't get any crumbs on it or mustard, and I could read it in the lunchroom, then put it back out on the newsstand. Well, I got frustrated because I'd look at 3 or 4 different titles, and maybe once a month or so, they might have an article or a mention of the Northwest. So I got the desire to actually publish a magazine when I was probably about a senior in high school or a freshman at the University of Portland. So when I got married and I started teaching at Central Catholic and was making a few bucks, and my wife was working for a telephone company, so we scraped together about $5,000. They brought the first issue out in 1967. Now, 1967 was kind of a legendary period of time because we had, as a governor of Oregon, an incredible publicist by the name of Governor Tom McCall. Big, tall, imposing fellow with a booming voice, and he'd been a news broadcaster on, I think it was Channel 8 for many years. Decided that he wanted to be governor, and what really struck me about him was that he wanted, on his platform, one of the major things he wanted to do was take the Willamette River and clean it up. Because of the paper mills coming down from Halsey in southern Oregon by Eugene and other paper companies, there would be this gunk. And if you were fishing in the Willamette, which I did sometimes at the mouth of Johnson Creek or Sear and Cutthroat in the fall, you get this slime on your line. You couldn't troll because your treble hooks would hook up with the slime. So anyway, McCall said he wanted to clean up the Willamette River. And so immediately I thought that was great. And I also, when I was at Central, as probably a freshman or sophomore, I loved to read, and I looked for books on fishing. So I came across a book that was written by a fellow from Canada named Roderick Haig Brown. And Roderick Haig Brown had grown up in England as fly fishing, and he was well educated. He moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, or I should say to British Columbia, and to Campbell River up on Vancouver Island. He wrote about 20 books over his lifetime. I read probably almost all of them. 10 of them were angling books. And he had a philosophy of catch and release, and to be kind to nature and not to over-abuse, the timber through forestry practices. And he was essentially my saint. We all have, if you're a good Catholic, you got a patron saint, maybe even have a guardian angel. So myself, trying to be a good Catholic, I thought, wow, Haig Brown, it was my hero. Yeah. And Tom McCall was kind of a brave man charging ahead. And so, and being the fact that he was a Republican and I had run for the State House of Representatives as a Democrat, that didn't stop me from supporting him all the way. So we got involved with the magazine. First issue came out in 1967. Immediately I started writing articles against snagging salmon, which was legal in some places in Washington. I got involved in encouraging challenging editorials on why wild fish should be released, particularly in rivers like the Deschutes. And the whole idea was that, if you took a game of tennis, after you play tennis, you don't eat the ball, you don't eat the football after you play football. So maybe you should release the valuable wild fish that the genetic strains are so important for and just kill hatchery fish. So that was it in a nutshell. And so ever since then, I've been 50, 60 years a radical when it comes to releasing wild fish, whether they be steelhead or salmon or our beloved steelhead.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. And of course, because of salmon, trout, steelheader is probably why I got a C- in chemistry at Central Catholic, because I was much more focused on reading salmon, trout, steelheader than I was my chemistry book. So
bless your heart. Okay.
So what a great history. And of course, both you guys have been deeply, and me to somewhat of a lesser extent. But I remember even in high school, a friend of mine, Cadino is a well-known name in the fishing circles. And my friend Marty Cadino, who I would fish with,
Sure.
And show up late to basketball games because of it.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Hey, have you ever considered joining the Steelheaders?" And I didn't know much about it. And to a high school kid that was making $2.75 an hour, the dues were somewhat expensive.
an hour, that's a lot.
Yeah, exactly. I love those days.
Yeah. So, Mike, you and Frank, I don't know the history with any leadership roles that you took at the Steelheaders, but I know Mike had ascended into leadership, and I'm curious. And you talked a little bit about that already, Mike. But what if we're not repeating ourselves because we want to keep the material fresh, but the process of the Steelheaders coming together, what was like? We're always, responding. We get the greatest response from the sport fishing public when a crisis is at hand. We're dealing with hatchery reductions of funding from the Corps of Engineers to ODF&W that are going to eliminate the summer steelhead program in the Upper Willamette Basin, that are going to reduce trout plants by about 65% in the Willamette Valley.
Wow.
And we're going to lose over about 167,000 spring Chinook smolts in the basin. So if you guys can give a brief overview about what was the trigger with steelhead. They're placed on a pedestal, appropriately so. But what brought the Steelheaders and you guys together to say, it is time to make this happen?
Well,
You go ahead.
Well, the Steelheaders organization was started with the whole concept of eliminating the gill nets on the Columbia River, period. That's what they pushed. Everywhere you went, that's what they talked about. That got a lot of sports fishermen going, wow, why are they taking the salmon and the steelhead? But once it became steelhead, everybody knows about steelhead. It's like a mystique. A steelhead, how do you catch one of those things? That kind of thing all the time. And I know when I first started steelhead fishing, right after I got married, I caught my wife. Now I had to go catch something as important, if not more important. And I was kind of looking for something else to do, I guess. And so I went to they used to have a Steelheaders clinic every November at the Masonic Temple in downtown Portland.
I remember.
So I went down there in 1969, the same year I got married. And my wife and I walked through, and I says, I'd like to learn how to steelhead fish, and joined the Steelheaders. And the whole idea, the reason I joined the Steelheaders was to learn how to steelhead fish. And of course, they had a lot of people there. Frank was there with his books and his magazine, and just starting his books, I think, around that year. And I got to know Frank a little bit, and I spent every waking hour from that day forward when I went to that clinic and joined the Steelheaders. I would tell my wife, I won't go on Sunday because that's when we go to church, but I'd get a call from somebody Saturday night before we went, and they'd say, hey, they're running on the Sandy, or they're running on the Clackamas. You want to go? Oh yeah, I'll be there. What time? So that didn't last very long. I spent every day, every hour I could trying to learn how to steelhead fish. In fact, it took me almost 2 years. 1971, I hooked and landed my first steelhead on the Sandy River around Oxbow Park, pulled it up on the bank, flopping around, reached down and unhooked it, turned around, put my rod down, and flopped, swam away. I'll never forget it as long as I live. But I didn't give up. I used to go and sit on the bank up high and watch people steelhead fish. And that's how I learned how to fish. When okie drifters were popular, or if it was cluster eggs or whatever, I would sit there and watch them. I see where they threw it, where the thing. I actually went to Marmont at the slaughter hole, and it was clear enough you could stand up above, and I'd hold on to the trees in one hand and look down, and I'd see the lines go by these steelhead that were laying there, and then I'd see a steelhead open its mouth and take one, and I'd notice what they took. And after 71 and 72 was the first year I went to the Deschutes River, I started catching them. And then bought my first drift boat in 73, first jet boat in 74, and then I had to be a river guide starting in 1975. You know, I guess that's a natural stage.
And you're still on your first wife?
Yes, yeah. Probably a few thousand steelhead, but only one wife.
As an aside, I think when I got my drift boat about the same time that Mike did, but I was a much older age, while I was learning how to handle a drift boat, I think my first trip down to Deschutes, I followed your boat. Yeah, and that was
I don't know if that's the time Tony was with you or not.
And I don't know if I was.
I think one was me and one was Nick.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I didn't do it. I don't remember Nick going with us. I remember you going with us.
Really?
I remember
Okay.
we were at the fur run where he caught his steelhead on a fly rod.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So,
Oh.
and then after that, once I learned how to steelhead fish, then I really wanted to let other people enjoy that. It was like my thing was to spread it. If I could, in fact, when I was president of the Northwest Steelheaders, I'd take the Portland chapter. We'd have a yearly fish out on the Deschutes. We'd all go and stay at the park, the Deschutes Park at the mountain, hike up, and have big barbecue at night and stuff for 3 years in a row. Then by 76, I was probably going too much myself in my jet boat. So
it was a very social thing. You learned how to catch a steelhead, and when I was editing salmon trout steelheader early on, the first few years actually, every so often I would get a letter from California, or from Washington, or Idaho, or something, and the guy would be all excited writing the letter, and he said, "Dear Mr. Amato, I just caught my first steelhead after 5 years of trying." And I would read that, and I just couldn't believe it. The dedication to this idea of catching this wonderful, glamorous fish.
Yeah.
And then, of course, through the 70s, the feeling of conservation of wild fish started to growing, and this idea of making a sacrifice and offering something back to the river in the way of a live fish. And it kind of all went along with the same thing that the great governors of Oregon, Vic Atiyeh and Bob Straub and Tom McCall, were preaching through the 70s. And two of them were Republicans and one of them was a Democrat. They were friendly with one another. Mm-hmm. And there were some just incredible, wonderful politicians that kind of led this feeling towards saving the natural resource.
Yeah, and so as history progressed, and you guys got that checked off the tick mark there, you got steelhead reclassified as a sport fish, and I don't recall what year it was. I might have been around 2014, but after a lot of persistence and a lot of politicking, and again, governors stepping in to make gill nets, the Columbia River reforms happen, which got gill nets off the main stem for spring Chinook and for summer Chinook, and prioritizing a sport fish opportunity on the main stem Columbia. So, I'm curious, as far as you guys go, obviously a huge accomplishment for the sport fishing community. You guys played a role in it as starting the grassroots effort to grow the Steelheaders membership and to preach about the value of sport fishing from an economic and a social perspective. I think a lot of us, all of us that are sitting at this table, we understand the value of bringing new foot soldiers into this community of people, because this is such an iconic species that you guys are a living testament about that number, hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of advocacy that you've produced over your time to make sure that steelhead do not wink out on our watch. And so, do you guys have some thoughts on the Columbia River reforms, and, understand that you, as part of this larger community, had a key role in making those happen and getting gillnets largely off the main stem?
Well, it's such a complicated subject. And I mean, we can just take one fish, for example, and not the summer steelhead that used to go up the Willamette River. Willamette River really historically didn't have any summer steelhead. And through hatchery processes, we were able to adopt, I think it might have been a strain from Washington, the Washougal strain of steelhead.
Santiam.
Skamania
steelhead.
I'm thinking of Willamette Santiam.
Yeah, and the Oregon State Game Commission established a run that became really successful, up to like 50 or up to 30,000 summer steelhead a year going up the Willamette to such tributaries as South Santiam and the Molalla, the Clackamas, etc. Well, and it was really successful. Hundreds of thousands of anglers and people were enjoying those fish. Then along came a split in the steelhead supporting group, and some started deciding that, well, we only want these hatchery steelhead are hurting the wild steelhead runs. And so then the game department started managing on the idea that, well, we'll save the wild steelhead. There were fewer of them, almost wild winter steelhead, than there were the summer steelhead, but they were willing, the Game Commission and the commissioners, to sacrifice an incredibly successful hatchery run in order to save fewer wild steelhead. And that was kind of a big problem. And I don't think it was right in the long run. I don't think it's proven to be right. The summer steelhead have been gone for quite a few years now. The wild steelhead have not returned in any numbers compared to where they were previous to all of this happening. And we totally lost the summer steelhead. From a point of view of economics, it makes absolutely no sense, because a steelhead equivalent of a steelhead in England is called an Atlantic salmon. And if you buy a piece of property in England and it's on a river and 10 fish are caught per year in that pool of water, the capital value of each fish is something like $20,000 or $30,000 per fish. So if that piece of water on your property produces 10 fish a year, that's worth almost $250,000 just the fishing rights. That's just for 10, 12 fish. We take a look at the value, the economic value, not even taking into account the sport fishing value, but the economic value of those 20 to 30,000 hatchery fish that were created from where nothing existed before, and on dams that had blocked historic passage to wild steelhead. And it kind of the Game Commission and the people that argued to get rid of the hatchery fish, they just totally blew it and destroyed, I think, the spirit of the Willamette Valley Steelheaders, of which there are probably 100,000 of them, as well as not helping the wild steelhead. Wild steelhead numbers are okay, but they've never come back at all. And the important thing that I don't think that the fisheries people really recognized, or maybe they knew it and ignored it, was that in order to get baby fish into the rivers, you've got to have fish bodies up there decaying and creating something. A friend of mine who's caught 10,000 steelhead, who's written for our magazine and we've published several of his books, he lives in Michigan. His name is Jim Bedford. Told me just a couple of weeks ago, I asked him, well, how's fishing in the Great Lakes, Jim? And he said, it's really horrible, Frank. He said, you can look down to the bottom and there's no nutrients in the water anymore. The water is clear. I think it's the quagga clam or the quagga something has kind of was introduced. And with all of the cities now sending out water, there's no fertilization in the Great Lakes and the fish population is destroying. Well, the same thing happened to these streams in the Cascades, Clackamas, Santiam, you name it. The dams that were created and the lack of anadromous fish bodies going up and fertilizing the rivers after they die, that's essentially killed the food source for the wild trout up there. I used to, when I was a kid and started fly fishing when I was about 18, I started at Fish Creek above North Fork Dam on the Clackamas. I could stand in one place in June and hook 10 keeper-sized wild trout. And most of them were cutthroat, but most of them were rainbows, baby steelhead in effect. And now you just don't find those baby fish up there. There's just no food. There's no adult fish going up and dying and fertilizing that. You can thank, the dams, but essentially I think you can thank the Fish Commission for not allowing fish to go up and die and fertilize the streams.
Mm-hmm. So, well, just going what he said earlier, here's what I think needs, or the reason it worked so well back in the 70s. Not only did we have good politicians that were aware of it, but we also had people like Walt McGovern that put all the effort into it and worked day and night to make it happen. And he was able to organize other people around him to do the same thing. That's really key.
Yeah.
You have a leader, and somebody like Walt, who was a leader, he actually came from California, had moved up here. He was an organizer of the Young Republicans in California before he moved up here. So he already had some experience in organizing things and politics, and he knew how to work it. But we don't have a Walt McGovern now, and we don't have the issues to push the sportsmen to go ahead and get the nets off the Columbia River, for sure. I mean, I'm surprised 50 years later, after we passed the Steelhead Initiative, the damn nets are still on the river. When I think about it now, I think we wanted them off back in the 60s, and they're still killing salmon and steelhead today. And it's amazing with all the other things that the fish have to go through, the dams, the pollution, the overharvesting, and there's still some fish around.
Yep, they have the fall fishery and they're able to harvest fall Chinook and some coho as well. And you're right, they still intercept some of those B-run steelhead on the main stem there. Mm-hmm. They are caught in the large mesh nets. For all intents and purposes, they are not harvesting or interacting with the wild winter steelhead because there's no spring fishery. There's a little test net fishery that happens every Monday, and they have some drifts, but they release them under those circumstances. So, it could, between a reduction or an elimination of gill nets on the main stem for spring Chinook, having a positive impact on wild winter steelhead, coupled with what's happened here, and I've walked the halls of Congress myself on this, getting about 43 sea lions removed from the base of Willamette Falls is now, I mean, in a long series of not so great news about our salmon and steelhead, we are seeing wild winter steelhead returns on the Willamette Basin probably close to 3 to 4 times what they were just a few years ago. Now, well, we had about just shy of 900 steelhead come back maybe about 6 years ago. Now we're seeing about 8,000 and possibly 9,000 wild winners go over the falls this year. That's one of the highest returns in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, it's an incredible jump.
But how about this?
So that's right. It's probably because of removing the sea lions.
It's helped, yeah.
Yeah, it's helped.
But how about the shifting baseline of you guys that were around and remember the Sandy Am winter steelhead fishery when we were having 25, 30,000 wild winners going over the falls? And let's not lose sight of what the possibilities for these basins are. You guys have touched on it already, nutrient enhancement being an important component. I'm curious about your thoughts now. Yeah, and you guys are both strong wild fish advocates, which is certainly what we need. I've had this, after guiding for 28 years and fishing longer than that, seeing, it wasn't in my mind like when the conservation plan on the coast came through. This is probably about a decade ago, and they decided to eliminate hatchery winter steelhead plants on the Kilchis River, for example. I was like, well, is that really a big loss? Because they didn't contribute a lot to the fishery. We have these washed out stocks of hatchery fish, and they're in nearly every basin. And then the integration of these wild broodstock programs that are jump-starting some of these fisheries. Again, I want to hint a little bit towards how important it is for wild fish to be part of our wild fish management, our overall fish management program in the state of Oregon. We're seeing broodstock programs coming online for coho on the coast now, in the North Fork, Nehalem, and in the Trask systems. This year was the first adult returns for that. We've had for 20 years wild broodstock programs on the Wilson and the Nestucca, almost as long on the Clackamas and Sandy. Our groups collectively spend a lot of time fighting for better habitat conditions and dam removal, of course. And now you guys again have a history here, even prior to Mark Select Fisheries, where we started fin clipping all the fish. Is for example, I've trained my clientele over the years that taking fish home is a pretty cool thing, and we've lost somewhat of the sportsman's mantra about the value of catch and release fishing. The importance of wild fish in Oregon and the future it's going to play, especially given the fact that we're facing some serious climate change issues. How important is it to make sure that those wild fish are one, maintained as a population, but two, integrated into our propagation programs so we have a more resilient broodstock over time?
Yeah, that's something that I don't feel really qualified to talk about because it's something, I suppose, in the high echelons of Oregon State Fisheries and University of Washington Fisheries Departments that have to experiment with studies, and of course those take time and take money to do. I kind of just stick to the basic things of, I'd like to see river food enhancement situations, even to the simple point of hiring people to drive up and down the stream every 3 or 4 days and actually putting some good minerals or something that would promote a little bit more food and insect growth in some coastal streams particularly, and also Cascade streams. Streams east of the Cascades, they seem to be fairly food productive. But I don't know, some creative new things need to come along.
I don't know why you can't have both. That's the thing that bothers me the most, is that why can't you have hatchery and wild fish? I just look at that and say, you're not going to get the people buying fishing license to support the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife if you only have native fish that they never see, they never catch. And if they do catch it, I got to put it back. I can't take it home and eat it. And when I was in the steelhead fishing, we could catch anywhere from 6 to 8 fish a day in the 70s. steelhead fishing, once you got good enough to know how to catch the damn things,
Yeah.
you could do very, very well. That enhanced other people to go out, buy fishing licenses, buy gas, buy Salmon Trout Steelhead magazine, and do everything. We need to get somehow between hatchery and native production and not have one kill off the other. That's where I'm coming from.
Right. Yeah, and I think what we've seen through science is that wild fish return at a much higher rate than hatchery fish do. We have these washdown stocks that have been inbred generation after generation that have, the Willamette's a perfect example. We plant about 5.5 million spring Chinook smolts into the Willamette Basin, yet on a good year, 50 or 60,000 come back. So, but if you get wild brood stocks, so that's less than 1%, you get a wild broodstock fish that might return somewhere between 3 to 7%, pretty close to what wild fish return at. You don't have to, produce as many to have a magnified benefit.
This graph, if we can show it up on the screen.
You got it. You're good.
Yeah, this graph tells an interesting story because this is the year 1800, let's say 200 years ago. And this was the fish population of wild fish. This is today, the year 2009, but actually 2020 now. And no food. Wild fish population, no food. The streams have either been dammed or they've been farmed, and some of the animals that created habitat, like beavers, have been killed by the millions. Everything has changed, but the thing that's really changed, the wild fish population is almost diminished to maybe 10 or 5% of its original size in the Northwest, whereas the amount of money spent on fisheries has gone just the opposite direction to the point now where if you figured that what the Bonneville Power Administration and all of the utilities pay in the Northwest for studies and hatcheries and everything else, it must be getting near $1 billion or more. But my suggestion is that the fisheries departments in Oregon and Washington State and even California, Humboldt, pick out a stream in each state and artificially put some food in it and enrich it to see if just the simple act of getting some feed to these starving little baby fish when they're born, if that could get the wild fish population just on a couple of pilot streams to increase so that it became more reasonable that instead of all spending these billions of dollars on hatcheries and schooling and all of that, they could get to the basics of feeding the progeny of the wild fish that are spawning. There are enough wild fish spawning, but the fact of the matter is there's nothing for these little fish to eat.
Yeah, well said. And yeah, there's no question a lot of work to do, and there's great organizations doing that work, of course. And I know in particular in the Willamette, NSIA, along with the Steelheaders, and I know CCA's having a hand in this too. We're talking with the members of Congress about the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers budget proposal is to strip about $900,000 from their mitigation obligations in the basin, which again would eliminate the summer steelhead program altogether in the upper basin, and it would reduce trout plants by about 65%, and we'd reduce Chinook salmon, spring Chinook salmon production by about 167,000 fish.
So, Bob, is that money that they give to the state to do those programs?
That's right, yep.
And the state can't make that money up?
Well, you might imagine the state has a harder time doing it, and it's not really their responsibility. It is the Corps of Engineers as a federal agency that placed those dams in the upper basin, compromised the productivity of wild fish in the upper basin. So it is their mitigation obligation to keep those populations and those fisheries intact. That's what we've lost. They have that mitigation responsibility in association with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So it really is a federal issue, and it shouldn't be the responsibility of the state of Oregon or even sport anglers to make up the difference in that capacity. That is the Corps' mitigation responsibility for the projects they produce in the basin. So NSIA is working very hard on that, and I said other nonprofits are as well. But we're gonna, matter of fact, NSIA in the coming months is gonna be producing a lot of information and some campaign strategies to really kind of turn the corner on defending our hatcheries. There's a lawsuit right now brought by a wild fish advocacy group to reduce hatchery plants of the Thule strain Chinook in the lower Columbia Basin, which will have what I consider the last great fishery severely curtailed. The Buoy 10 fishery is turned into, largely because it is a marked select fishery, we catch a lot of Thules. It's really what fuels that in-river fishery now. If we lose the production there, the last great fishery, the only one I'm really make a living at as a fishing guide any longer, is likely to go away as well. So countless hours, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that the Department of Fish and Wildlife puts forward to defend their practices. We as sport anglers have had provided tremendous compromise. We've lost the summer steelhead program in the upper Clackamas Basin, the summer steelhead program in the Salmon River. We don't get cutthroat plants any longer, and the hatchery cutthroat plants in the coastal systems any longer. We have done our share to recover wild fish stocks. We've compromised consumptive opportunity throughout the state of Oregon, and we need to come together collectively as a community.
Well, the sport fishery has really suffered, but how, I've always kind of thought that the Indians kind of hold a lot of the cards because we made treaties with them and guaranteed their fishing rights and 50% of the fish plus food. And how are the Indian tribes handling this?
So they've been instrumental in our successes with Columbia Basin restoration in the Snake River in particular. Mm-hmm. Several of the tribal leaders, along with Liz of NSIA, Liz Hamilton from the Northwest Sport Fishing Industry Association, were the White House about a month and a half ago, signing the agreements that have effective, efficient steps to recover Snake River wild fish, which I'm sure some of the viewers have seen the graphs of what recovery looks like in the Snake Basin. We would not be in this position if it wasn't for the treaty tribes of the Columbia River Compact. So absolutely play a key role in that.
So that kind of eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, Idaho, that really is determined pretty much by Indian treaties, I would think. With the hatcheries and the survival of the salmon.
Right.
I don't think the tribes in the Willamette Valley have the strength that they do in the Columbia.
That's true. Mm-hmm. That's true. And just to put it in perspective, I wouldn't say we're on the trajectory right now, but this year, we're supposed to have a return of like 140,000 on the main stem Columbia.
Of steelhead?
Of spring Chinook.
Spring Chinook?
Yeah. About 140,000. But it wasn't that many years ago where we, in the 2001, where we saw about 450,000 spring Chinook back to the basin.
That was a storm.
Oh, it was crazy fishing. Yeah. Crazy fishing.
How was the summer run done? It had been really low a long time ago, and then it came back. But is the summer run of Chinook strong? Or
No. Certainly not relative abundance over history. This year, I think we're supposed to get maybe around 50 to 60,000 adults.
Well, when I've been in the spring down there catching at least for sturgeon sometimes, the smolts are coming down, and I see millions of mergansers and cormorants.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. It's like a slaughter of smolts.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob, there's I'm sorry.
Is there any talk of doing something more with the birds? I know they've tried to move them from place to place.
There's a graph that I've seen and promoted on some platforms I've had that actually shows what the rates of predation are and the impact they have on smolts. Mm-hmm. And much to my surprise is that this graph shows a bar that's very large for hydropower mortality, and then the combined other user groups of avian predation, seals and sea lions, saltwater and freshwater fishermen doesn't even come close to equaling hydropower mortality.
So it's a hydropower.
Yeah.
There's actually a guy that was commenting, Curtis Youngren. He says, I can't believe the wild steelhead groups don't push to remove seals and sea lions. And as you know, when you're down at buoy 10, there's it looks like a million of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's how we got that law passed. Credit ODF and W for producing the paper that showed there was a 89% likelihood of upper wild Willamette Basin winter steelhead going functionally extinct if we did not remove sea lions from Willamette Falls.
80%.
89% chance of extinction.
Yeah.
So when we circulated that around the halls of Congress, it got some attention, and it's one of the rare instances, thank goodness, that we had bipartisan, bicameral support for removing sea lions, because that's a pretty tough, tall ask.
Yeah.
So that was a success we had just a few years ago, and a critical one. Now they say that I'm on the Sea Lion Task Force that spent a lot of time studying this issue, is that the seals and sea lions that are based at pinch points such as Bonneville Dam and Willamette Falls, their diet consists north of 90% listed salmon and steelhead stocks of fish.
So it's just total salmon and steelhead.
And that's why the law, when it got passed, said we can lethally remove sea lions, both Stellers and Stellers was a big deal because they were listed under ESA not too many years ago. So we got them delisted. And then we got the amendment to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We're allowed to lethally remove both species of sea lions in any Columbia River tributary, Willamette, Cowlitz, Sandy, and above the I-205 bridge on the main stem Columbia. So they say that the sea lions and the seals, speaking from an adult perspective, their diet consists of less than 18% of salmon and steelhead when they don't have the impediments of a gill net or a sport angler catching a fish or Willamette Falls or Bonneville Dam. So the predation rates go down quite a bit.
Well, on those coastal rivers, of course, everybody thinks of the Rogue and the Umpqua, but in the smaller streams as well, are sea lions and seals a big challenges there? Do you think, or do you hear much about them?
My experience is that they're not. I mean, there's very few fish that we see as sport anglers that don't have the golden arches on them. So there's an interaction happening there.
Some marking.
Yeah, but I think the biggest mortality down in the estuary probably takes place from harbor seals during the spring out migration that's happening as we speak. Seals. They consume large amounts of juvenile salmonids headed to the ocean. So that's a problem that a lot of scientists in the government hasn't taken a close look at, and if they're able to address it. So,
well, as a kid, my wife grew up next to the Tulips River in Washington by Aberdeen, Oak Rim. And she'd live on a little farm, and she'd go out to this little stream that wandered through, and she would fish for and catch and pickle, I guess is the word for it, little fish that would, take an egg or something. She'd lay on a bridge and play. Now, there's thousands of little kids up and down the coast that have done that, and whether they're farmers' daughters or sons, is there much of, my feeling in a way is that we shouldn't allow any bait fishing for trout on those coastal rivers, no fishing with treble hooks on those coastal rivers, and do everything we can do, Wilson, Trask, etc., those kinds of rivers, to preserve the growth of rainbow trout and cutthroat trout. And has regulations gotten stiffer and tougher along those lines?
Yeah, in the sense that, I'm not sure what year it was, but there was a recognition of that issue. And trout fishing on the coast, for example, doesn't open in streams until the Memorial Weekend.
So they put it back later and a little bit out.
May 21st or something.
Yeah. And then there, and you've seen this yourself. You fish some coastal systems, and Boy, the interest in trout fishing on coastal streams is a fraction of what it was when I was growing up, and certainly when you guys were growing up.
And one of the pictures that I brought in to show, I don't know if we'll see it maybe later, but shows a trout fry, and it's a picture from about probably 1890 to 1910. And there's a couple people, and there are, I would guess, at least 200 or 300 dead trout that look like they're from about 6 inches to 12 inches long, from like either the Wilson or the Halem. And people have just gone out there and they've killed everything that they could find, and that's the trout fry. It's an incredible historical picture, but it sends the ugliest message imaginable about wiping out the future.
I've seen a photo similar from my grandfather who fished at the chutes with a stringer of 50, the limit was 50 trout, I think, back then.
That's it. Yeah, when I started, it was 10 in the magazine, and through efforts with the Anglers Club of Portland, which was a chapter of the Northwest Steelheaders.
Yes, it was.
We worked like crazy in the early 70s to change the regulation on the Deschutes to go from 10 fish down to 2 fish.
And they have to be over 14 inches.
And all the fishing clubs in Oregon supported it and really pushed it hard. And when it came time to argue the position in front of the game commissioners, I asked the president of the Northwest Steelheaders, Bill Lush, speaking as a longshoreman, as only he could do, speaking for the popular people of the state, and he pleaded with the Game Commission to reduce that limit on the Deschutes because there was no need to kill those fish and no need for a 10-fish limit. So it went from 10 fish down to 2 fish, which I think it still is, and no wild fish. And that was directly due to the influence of the Northwest Steelheaders being just that group that tilted the request. And the commissioners on like a 3-2 or 5-4 vote said yes, and that's the way it's been. And the shoots,
I think that was 1978.
something like that.
Nice.
Yeah. So that's been and one of the examples of how the Northwest Steelheaders kind of came through in the pinch, and one reason why they always have my support.
Here's a comment. I'll just read it out loud from Curtis Younger, and he says, there was a study worth noting that came out of Canada. A graduate student estimated harbor seals in the Salish Sea were eating up to 400,000 salmon and smolts annually. He mounted a pit tag reader on the head of seals to detect pit tags entering the seal's mouth, like magnets.
Wow.
With how many pinnipeds we have in the Columbia, I wonder how many we lose annually. That's like almost 500,000 Chinook just up there in Canada, so I'm sure.
Yeah. It's got to be a lot.
It's a problem.
It is. It is a problem. Yeah. And I don't know how to address it, frankly. Harbor seals are even cuter than sea lions.
Exactly. Right. Swimming cats.
People buy a lot of seal calendars.
Yeah, they do.
Oh, so cute.
Well, I think it'll be fun, you guys, if we give the listeners just a tip, about how to catch more fish. I mean, I know a lot of the audience looks to these informational opportunities when Tony has folks in, and I'll give you an example, and I'll make mine real short. You guys have much more knowledge about this than I do, but I grew up in Northeast Portland, and I grew up fishing the Sandy River in all aspects: Dodge Park, Oxbow Park, Revenue Bridge, a little bit in Marmot, and I just had the heck of a time catching steelhead here in the valley. And when I went to work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife around '88 after graduating from Mount Hood Community College, I started fishing smaller systems like the Nicanicum, like the Kilches, like the Wilson. And so, I obviously gained more experience over time to learn how to do it. But if I was to give a tip, my tip would be for steelheaders, and we are celebrating steelhead tonight, when I shifted from fishing the big metro rivers here, Clackamas is another example. I was too intimidated by the Clackamas. Plenty of people have it mastered. I'm not one of them.
That's
but
tough for you.
Yeah.
I used to catch spring Chinook out of it.
I used to check spring Chinook on it. But going from a big river system to a smaller system on the coast, if you're a beginner steelheader, don't be so excited to cut your teeth on a river like the Sandy. It's such a massive river system compared to the small Nicanicum or the Kilches where you can read the water real well. You kind of know where they're hiding.
Well, your advice is almost exactly what Bill Lush told me. When he would give these lectures, maybe you saw him, but he would give these, hour lectures with his chalkboard, and his main idea was to pick a section of a stream and really get to know it and keep fishing it. And he was right, exactly what you say. And I learned the ropes on Kellogg Creek, fishing for steelhead. And my cousin Charles learned the rope, his same age as me, 80. He learned the ropes on Johnson Creek in southeast Portland. One winter, he hooked something like 27 steelhead in Johnson Creek. All essentially probably wild steelhead. And the amazing thing is that Johnson Creek has been, degraded, and all the stuff that's gone down it, and agriculture and everything else. And up until at least 20 years ago, it had a fair run of essentially wild steelhead that was spawned all the way out beyond Gresham.
Wow.
And things have changed so much.
Yeah. Well, Mike, why don't you give a tip on...
Well, here's what I think.
Well, okay, go ahead.
You have to go, and go. Period.
Yeah.
No matter what you do. Michael Jordan didn't get as good as he gotten by playing basketball once a month. That's my tip. And go with somebody that knows what the hell they're doing. I know when I started, I just watched people. They didn't have many river guides when I first started steelhead fishing.
So Mike sent some pictures in. Why don't you tell us about these fish here?
Oh my gosh, look at that steelhead.
Remember that?
Do you see that
photo
one?
There?
That is a 22-pound steelhead caught February 12th, 1974 on the Sandy River.
Wow.
And I've got a story, but I won't tell. It takes too long.
We'll sum it up.
It's one of the things is my buddy had fished this hole the day before, and he got one about 15 pounds that was female. And I made a joke to him. I said, well, I'll go catch the buck in the morning because he's waiting for his female. So I got up in the morning, went out to the same spot, and that's where I caught that fish.
Here's one. Looks like a summer fish, maybe?
That's a Idaho fish caught on the Deschutes in 1978. And I put it up there to cover my hairy chest.
That's a fish bra. They call it a fish bra now.
And this in 1973, and you notice the big Northwest Steelheaders emblem on the front of the boat. I bought a Crenshaw boat with a friend of mine, Bud Larson, and had to take it to the river the first chance I got. So this was in the summer of 1973. And it didn't stay that nice for very long. And that picture with the big Chinook, 35-pound Chinook caught on the Trask River in 1978.
Wow.
And I'll tell you something about the Trask River back in the early 70s. In the fall, it had one heck of a run. You could see fish up to 50, 60 pounds caught in that river. And we used to put in the gravel pit and go down to 101. And the picture I just put up now was taken about a month and a half ago. That's my son, Matthew, who's a heck of a fisherman. I mean, a very good fisherman. And probably better than his dad. And his daughter, Josephine, fishing the Quinault. That's a fish she caught. And that is him with his oldest daughter, Willa. That was on the Quinault River. I guesstimated that one about 18 pounds. And then the other picture is me and my brother in 2019 on the Quinault River.
That's Amanda Park right there.
Yeah, that's Amanda Park.
There's a boat ramp right there.
Yep, that's where we put in. And I still go. I have a trip this Friday, actually, with my son-in-law. My daughter was very, very smart. She married a guy who likes to fish. I figured she wanted to see me more often, apparently. So I'm going with him on Friday over the North Fork of Lewis and Washington. I think we're going to fish for summer steelhead.
Now, these are some of the photos from back in the 70s, right?
This is 1974 in Salem. That's Don Wilner in the trench coat. The governor and Carrie Starzinger. And the one on the left is Carrie Starzinger went and found a frozen fish to have Governor McCall hold.
Yeah,
That's when he supported, he first supported Measure 15. That is Governor McCall looking at the bill. I think it's the initiative petition. That is Walt McGovern.
Yeah, it is.
And that is Lynn Malmquist to Walt's left, Carrie Starzinger behind him, and Chuck Voss to the right.
Wow. That's a great shot.
And this is after it was passed, meeting in the governor's office, and that's all the different people. Some are legislators that supported the measure. And that's my oldest son. The night that the Measure 15 was passed, I got him that fish. It wasn't good enough yet to go out and catch one himself.
Looks like you put that one in a smoker a little too long.
And he had to say Oregon Rainbow's cap on. This is Walt McGovern, Vicatia, and Walt's wife Lillian. I believe that was taken down at Salem the year that Governor Atiyeh became governor. And
here's a fun one.
There's a fun one. That's Frank Amato and his friend from Spain, who I took fishing. That's me still trying to hide my hair on my chest.
Frank, I don't know why you need a wading stick in that photograph. You look like about 14 years old.
I started using a wading stick in my 30s into the shoes.
Nice idea. Idea.
And I use felted boots, not with a cleat. And I've virtually never fallen with a wading stick.
Nice.
And I still, now I use a wading stick as a walking stick.
Yeah.
And it's still upright.
Good.
So who's this right here?
That would be Chuck Voss and Bill Lush. Chuck Voss, who was the executive director of the Northwest Steelheaders, and Bill Lush was essentially the president of the Steelheaders. Now, was also on the nuclear. He was also appointed by the governor to the Nuclear Sighting Committee.
He was president of Trout Unlimited.
He was also, was he president of Trout Unlimited?
Yeah, he was president of Trout Unlimited for 2 years.
National president of Trout Unlimited, yes. And we published his book. I heard him give a clinic, and I asked him if he could write up what he said in the clinic, just write it up. And he said, Frank, I can have it for you in a month or so. So a month later, he wrote it up, and we published a book by him called Steelhead Drift Fishing. And I wrote a little fly fishing section in it. And it became a kind of a historic little book.
I got a copy.
You got one.
I got an autographed copy.
Wow, I can't say that.
Great little book. That was a surprise. First book I ever published.
So where's your pictures, Dad? Why don't you talk about those?
Yeah, and this is Salilo Falls, part of it, because Salilo Falls was quite wide. But you can see a salmon trying to jump. You can see how powerful they were, either salmon or steelhead, getting over the falls. That's behind the Dallas Dam now, and maybe, 100, 200 feet of water. But the picture on the left indicates how important smoking the salmon and getting those 18 million pounds of salmon to eat for the Indians was. And this is a picture from probably the turn of the century, way back, up by the Dalles. The picture on the left is a commercial gillnet boat from 1890. Says, I can't quite read it, but old-time
gillnet sailboat.
Gillnet sailboat. They would gillnet down the Columbia, and then as soon as the wind would start coming in the afternoon or late morning, upstream wind, and the Columbia would get an incoming tide as well, they put up the sail and go back to Ilwaco or Astoria to sell the fish. And of course, a lot of people died by being carried across the bar. This is at Salilo Falls, and I don't know if it's Indians or pioneers, one way or the other, net fishing at Salilo. for one slip, no one's wearing a life vest, one slip and you're a dead man. And this was a fish scale that became very popular, I think in the 20s and maybe the 30s and maybe even before then. And you just anchored up in a fast part of the Columbia where the fish were forced to follow the edge of the shore up because it's calmer water. And you could see the pulleys on the line, and they could adjust where the wheel was, and they'd figure out where the path was that fish were following, and they'd just adjust the pulleys and make the just like putting a drift boat in, anchoring it, and moving it left or right to intercept the fish. But in this case, these are probably sockeye that they were catching there. They were so efficient that they, of course, became outlawed. The picture on the left is
and you know who got them outlawed? Gill netters.
Gill netters.
yeah.
Isn't it ironic?
For gill netters. And in this case, this is gill netting, I believe, or net fishing on the Rogue River around 1900. You can see the size of the average fish was pretty good.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, you weren't taking these photographs, were you, Frank?
These are all historic
with this
photographs over the years that I collected.
Senior project.
Yeah.
The picture on the left is a coastal Oregon stream where nets were allowed up until I think 1956, something like that.
Yeah.
They were made illegal in the coastal rivers. Yeah, this is the wholesale fish fry.
Wow.
This is probably down on the Halem or Tillamook Bay. And you can see a mixture of resident wild native steelhead and also sea run cutthroat and anything else that swam. And it was just and there are hundreds of these kinds of pictures in the archives of historical museums up and down the Pacific Coast.
Wow.
I mean, the early pioneers, they didn't let anything go to waste, but at the same time, they also weren't good for the wild strain or the wild genes.
You probably recognize this.
Yeah.
That's a link from NSIA's website.
Yep.
There you have it.
Yeah, and so, and first of all, thanks for bringing those pictures in, you guys. That's just a great historical marker, and I mean, we've all got those photographs of how it used to be, and and how important it is to document that. And it's no secret. I talked a little bit about shifting baseline, and I mean, I'm young at this, relatively speaking. You guys have more history than I do, and it wasn't when I first started guiding on Tillamook Bay. I'd catch at least 140 pounder a year. The Bob Tomans and the Ray Furlans, those guys were talking about catching a 40 pounder every week, and now a 40 pounder is a real rare occurrence. But
my cousin Charles used to talk to me about fishing in the lower Trask and tidewater and a big fish. I never, did that, but wow.
We thought you were fly fishing.
Those genes.
Yeah, it was awe-inspiring.
He fooled us all.
But
all those years we thought he was a fly fisherman, and then he buys a place
I got
over
40 pounders on the fly in Alaska.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
And that, that worked. In fact, I had an Italian friend who was fighting a fish. My son, Nick, was 14 at the time. They were in a John boat on the, I can't remember the name of the river, but
Lake.
Lake Creek, where it's sitting in it and yachting it.
Oh, yeah.
And the fish actually jumped into the boat. There was a low gunnel on one of those flat bottom boats, John boat, and my Silvio, my friend from Italy, said to Nick, "Your dad bumped a fish off my line last night when he was trying to net it. Don't you do that too, Nick?"
No pressure.
So Nick at 14 was nervous as heck. The water in the Yetna was the color of a dirt clod. You couldn't see the fish. I wasn't in the boat at the time. I wonder, they had to pull up anchor and go drifting down out of sight. They were on for a half hour, it seemed like. And I started really worrying about maybe some accident in trying to get the fish in. And then all of a sudden they emerged coming up the river, waving, and the fish had jumped into the boat. Silvio, all 5'5", jumped on it. The fish was 47 pounds.
Oh, wow.
And went back to Italy with him.
Oh, my gosh. Wow.
That was crazy.
Well, folks that really I'd like to get your guys' perspective on this in a minute here, but you guys have had these historical benchmarks where you've gotten steelhead listed or reclassified as a sport fish. The gill nets have come off the Columbia. Mark select fishing, mass marking, which is allowed for consumptive opportunity while releasing the wild fish, which has certainly been your platform, Frank. We're at the point now, given the threats that are happening with the Corps of Engineers and the hardcore wild fish advocates, that we've really got to step up now more than ever, because we're losing fisheries at a faster pace than we've seen before.
Absolutely.
And NSIA has been forefront on addressing this crisis with the severe cuts in funding from the Corps of Engineers to the state of Oregon. We developed this petition that Tony's going to put up on the screen if you haven't seen it yet. That's on the NSIA homepage. Simply just put your name and address in, and it'll automatically send a letter to your 2 state senators as well as your congressional representative. And we've had 1,600 letters already sent in to members of Congress.
And this is some of the info that you were talking about.
Yep, that's what we're looking at. Eliminating summer steelhead program by 2025, spring Chinook by 172,000 fish, and reducing trout plants. You guys have both hinted on this about, we all have our gateway drug, and trout for a lot of us is our gateway drug for fishing, elevate us into other species, cold water species to fish for. So how important is this issue that we need to tell our members of Congress who direct the budgets for federal agencies such as our U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to maintain funding for those programs so that we have these opportunities for the citizens of Oregon and for healthy, abundant recreational outdoor activities as a family and as friends and as a community. So go to the NSIAfishing.org website. Sign up to send a letter to your congressional member. We had a town hall, a handful of steelheaders in Corvallis and Albany went to a town hall with Senator Merkley last weekend. I'm trying to organize a greater town hall for people to participate, to tell the senator how important these Willamette fisheries are to our community. And we really need our community to step up and be part of this conversation. And as I alluded to, in the coming months, you're going to see some information about some campaigns, one particular campaign in particular that we're going to launch to help recover, not just defend the fisheries we have now, but to mend that the sport fisheries that we've lost over time that you guys have been a big part of. So more information will be released in the coming months about that, but it's a pretty exciting opportunity. But nothing happens, as you guys have seen time and time again, without community support. And it's really time for anglers of all walks of life, whether you're a fishing guide, a sport angler, or even somebody who just enjoys having fish in our waterways, to come together and protect these fisheries for future generations of Oregonians. So,
well, I'd say this: you need more things like we're doing right now. You need Frank had a magazine that he produced that everybody read. At least everybody during my time steelheading read, and he was a big push on conservation. We don't have that right now. Everybody's worried about where they're going to make a few bucks to live. They're not concentrated on, I don't have any fish anymore, because they didn't have any in the last 10 years anyway.
right.
We had great fisheries and we wanted to protect them. Today, we don't have great fisheries. To get people motivated, you have to have more programs like we're doing now, and more public, like you say, forums and things to get people involved.
Yep, and we've gone to this, social media platforms to do our advocacy, and it's just you're not going to solve these issues on social media.
No.
You got to come to the town hall events. You got to write letters to your members of Congress And if you're, depending on what level of commitment you are to recover these fisheries, at the very least, people should be involved with advocacy organizations like the Northwest Sport Fishing Industry Association, the Association of Northwest Steelheaders, and the Coastal Conservation Association. They are doing the talking for the sport angler. We've seen what happens when we leave this work to a state agency that I believe is highly competent. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is who I'm referencing. But they just
You
don't
say competent or incompetent?
No, they're competent in my mind, and I'm a little bit biased because I used to work for them. But they have very dedicated, brilliant people running that agency. Not everybody would agree, but that's my take on it. And I work with them really closely in a lot of capacities. But it's going to take more than just the agency to bring this issue forward. We need really an army of sport angling enthusiasts to elevate this issue, not just this issue, but all the issues associated with the loss of sport fishing opportunity, come together as a community to make these changes.
Well, again, it's going to take an issue that people can grab a hold of. And you could visibly see the gill nets, so it was kind of easier for us. But it's you lost fish because they didn't build a hatchery. People don't see that. They can't grab a hold of that.
Yeah, it is harder to see, but I mean, a 65% reduction in trout plants in the Willamette Valley. The trout is the most highly sought after sport fish in the state of Oregon. People are going to feel the pain from that. So, you guys continue to do the great work you do with the editorials and the magazine you produce, and thanks for the pitch for the guides forecast. Your work at Salmon Trout Steelheader has been so inspirational to me that our Chinook members on the guides forecast have access to articles on Salmon Trout Steelheader that you guys have produced. I've worked really close with Tony on getting those articles published, repurposed on the guides forecast. You guys have a great website that gives a lot of great information. A lot of those articles are published on your website, and of course your immense library of books that still have a lot of application at today's fisheries are available on the Salmon Trout Steelheader website as well. So,
what's that, Dad?
who gets that sticker? We could sell that for.
What is that picture?
I bought I was on the Deschutes River Advisory Committee put on there by the governor of TIA. And I suggested to the people on the advisory committee in one of our meetings that we take the jet boats off of the chutes, and that went down like a lead balloon. And so,
as I was jet boat, many bought one.
And I told, look, you guys, if you don't take the jet boats off, I'm buying one myself. So they said, okay, we're gonna take them off above Maupin, but from Shears Falls down to the mouth. Historically, they had a long claim to being in there. And so I told them, look, tomorrow I'm going to go out and buy myself a jet boat. And I bought Old Blue from Alumaweld, and that label was on the bottom of Old Blue. Today it would probably be banned or outlawed.
Well,
but that boat of mine has about 25,000 river miles on it, mostly on the Deschutes.
Yeah.
And our boats are built better.
I thought that
Our bottoms are built better. That's yeah. Thanks, Tony, for showing that. That's great.
And
there's many nights sleeping.
There's that beautiful boat for sale now.
Yeah, it is for sale. That might be why I'm showing it right now.
Yeah.
But go to Craigslist. It's on Craigslist right now.
Yeah. For your bargain 25,000 mile boat.
They hold up.
Yeah, never had an accident. Once I clipped a rock in the Deschutes and thought I'd broken the impeller, and turned out that I just glanced off the side of the rock and the racket. And what had happened is I was dragging the launching line and all the way up through the lower river rapids, and finally the rope wrapped around the impeller, and I hit a rock just before that, and I thought I'd broken the pump.
Oh yeah.
And I was with a guy named Bill Stinson, the Fentonwick rep for the Northwest at the time. I said, Bill, grab the oars and pull us over because we don't have any power. So I did. And I looked inside the impeller and wrapped around like a rattlesnake inside the impeller was the rope. And we cut that out and we continued on for 4 days camping and fishing.
Oh,
And the boat, that was
That's
the worst
back when
accident it ever had.
That's back when you learned the river by hitting a few rocks.
That's right. Every once in a while,
Yeah.
bang, and boy, did it make a noise.
Yeah.
Sound like a cathedral.
You didn't get to
church
follow
bell.
somebody up the river.
Yeah.
well, you guys, it's been a productive conversation.
I've got a couple things.
Yeah.
Frank is going to be with Art Lindgren this Saturday. Art wrote a book about Frank, and he's going to be there signing books from 11 to 1 o'clock at the Fly Shop in West Lynn, correct?
Oh,
Oh, that's close. I'll
So
see you.
if you've got time, you can go talk to Frank and Art. And then we also have
Let me
a
see, can I see the book?
sale going on the AmatoBooks.com. 35% off on all of our books. You just use the code
He looks mean,
Spring
doesn't he?
2024. So Spring 2024. This is actually it deals mostly with the 70s probably
Yes.
as well.
It's
In
the whole
Washington.
history of the river.
I'm going to get a copy of that.
And it's from Washington, state of Washington. point
Yeah,
of
state
view.
of Washington. If you're gonna get into the fishing and fisheries state stuff, this is a good book to learn about the history of it. A lot of what's going on is a repeat of times past. Like what's that? Christmas Carol or whatever. Groundhog's Day.
Groundhog's
Day. There you go. But it's push, pull, ocean bad, ocean good, push, pull. Anyway, you can learn a lot from this book. And so I want to thank my dad for coming in.
Thanks, Tony.
Mike
Thanks.
and
for having
Bob
us
for
again.
being the MC.
Yeah,
'Cause
cool.
He's better at it than I am. Trust me. But I'll let him finish up.
Yeah, again, I feel really honored to be invited into this conversation. I think what's not lost on the audience is the fact that the steelhead classified as a game fish is 50 years old this year. Is that right? You don't remember the date that happened, you guys?
It was November 6th or 7th, 1974.
Wow.
The initiative petition was, we won by the largest percentage of any initiative up until that time.
Wow.
67% of the Oregonians voted to make steelhead a game fish in the state of Oregon. And 33% said no, of course. And we were outspent 20-1.
Wow.
So it's a great, like I say, my good friend Walt McGovern deserves a lot of credit for that. And he was the one behind it, and he deserves that.
Yeah, the commercial lobby put in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
amount of money into that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, job well done.
Well, everybody's worked hard for these fish, and we hope everybody out there watching continues to work hard for these fish because things can sure slip away.
Oh, it's happened before our very eyes. So thanks for the opportunity, Tony, and Frank for the invitation. And Mike, it's been a great pleasure to meet you for the first time, although I've heard your name over the decades. Charles Voss, I've
I
heard
don't like
his
the
name.
word.
Heck, what? Yeah.
I don't like the decades thing.
Well, you only look 47. But
Yeah.
I saw today. I saw a picture that Buzz put of you on the Clackamas with somebody. I forget the other guy's name.
Jack Smith.
Yeah. I just saw it today. I'm like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Jack Smith,
Yeah.
huh?
Yeah. I had a great time fishing with a lot of really good people. In the 70s, Buzz, Herb Good, Jack Smith, Frank Amato. It's been
It was a good
a
time.
real thrill
Good time.
up until now. Now, again, I'm not quitting. I go as often as I can. I don't own a jet boat anymore or a drift boat. Actually, I take that back. My son-in-law now owns my drift boat. He has a place on the Salets. Call me at 777-777, and I'll give you his address.
Well, very good.
All right.
Thanks again for the
All
time, you guys, and subscribe to the
Okay.
YouTube channel for Salmon Trout Steelheader, and keep buying their wonderful products so we can keep doing these things. So
Yes.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.